Well, thank you for that wonderful intro. I hope to add some additional information for y'all. As Javi said, I'm one of the two urban biologists that we have out in San Antonio for Texas Parks and Wildlife, one of 9 in the state. I'll go over our distribution a little bit on a later slide, but I'm here to kind of give you guys my true confessions of an urban wildlife biologist talk. I give this talk quite frequently, and I give it to different audiences. Usually it's at universities, at schools, to college students, letting them know that this field existed. Because I didn't know that this field existed of urban ecology until I was applying for a job to be one. So I try to get that word out. And so I'll kind of move some things around since we're with a slightly different audience today, but hopefully y'all get some good stuff out of it. I'll try to get through it in a timely manner and then leave some good time for questions at the end. So the reason I go through all my educational background and all that kind of stuff is usually because I'm talking to those students and letting them know what I did. Not that it is necessarily the right way or the best way or anything like that, but just give them an idea of a way that you can do it. But I'll breeze through it for y'all. I got my bachelor's of science from Texas State. That's mostly true. I bounced around to several different universities before I found my forever home, but Texas State is the one that stuck. Has a very good wildlife program, very good field-oriented stuff. I think like a lot of people that grew up loving wildlife, I often get asked that question. Heck, in all my interviews, I get asked that question. How did you get into wildlife? Why are you into this field? And I don't really have a great answer for it because I don't remember a time that I wasn't into wildlife. That's always kind of been there since the beginning. Now, what I thought a job in wildlife was changed a lot throughout my life. I thought crocodile hunter, and then in nature documentaries and wildlife rescue, and then in high school I did FFA and I was a vet tech assistant because that was kind of close-ish. And then in college I finally was able to pursue the wildlife thing. But I think like a lot of wildlife students that are early on in their career, I thought I was going to work with charismatic megafauna. That's our big fancy word for the bears, the tigers, the cool big animals that everybody knows and loves and are on all the posters and all the fundraising opportunities. But I wasn't a very good student in undergrad, and I got pretty close to dropping out several times, and I was starting to think maybe I wasn't actually cut out for this career that I dreamed up this whole time. And then I took a course called field ornithology. It was a 6-week course over the summer, focused on practical field experience, taking you out, teaching you how to identify birds, dropping you on the landscape, teaching you how to listen for them, listen how to look for them. That's how I knew it was a canyon towhee when I saw it up on the screen. But I'll admit, I wasn't 100% because I was at the back and I couldn't really get a sense of scale. But I saw that little bit of a kind of pale red, rusty on the tail and brown on the body, and that seemed like probably canyon towhee to me. And I got like 103, 104 in that course, and that was what really changed that trajectory. Before that course, I thought, I think birds are kind of neat. My dad liked them, my grandma liked them, but I don't know if I'll study them or anything like that. And then after that course, it's all of my professional work until I got hired on with DPWD. Never in my life, with how terrible of a student I was, did I ever think I'd continue on and get a master's degree. Never thought that was going to happen. But in the last semester of my senior year of undergrad, I got bit with a research bug. I got given this small little research opportunity with a small grant that was funded by selling tacos outside of the science building that I used to buy my first pair of binoculars to do a little bit of research on our nest box program at Texas State University. I used the air quotes on research because nothing really came out of it and it wasn't very high quality work, but I didn't really know what I was doing. And really what I got out of it was, hey, this research stuff is kind of cool. And so I approached one of my professors, asked if I could continue on and get a master's in his lab. And thankfully, he didn't look too closely at those transcripts, and he gave me a thumbs up. And then he had already said yes by the time he realized what he'd signed on to. But, I made it through that. I wrapped up undergrad with like a 2.96, and I wrapped up grad school with like a 3.8. So, I got better at school as time went along. And then this is the wordiest slide that I have in my entire presentation. I'll get through it in one big, deep breath. Habitat characteristic profiles, an intuitive approach to evaluate species-habitat relationships, and as demonstrated on several Texas bird species. That's the name of my thesis. If you're only going to do it once, you might as well make it long and convoluted and make yourself have a chore later on in your life that you're going to have to repeat. And thankfully, out of that thesis, we just a couple months ago got Plappert et al. Published in the Journal of Field Ornithology. So we got a publication out of it. All of that is a whole bunch of words and mess to say I looked at 8 species of birds that are found within the Oaks and Prairies Joint Venture region and looked at their habitat association. So what aspects of habitat do they cue in on? A lot of people that do habitat modeling make these really complex, convoluted models with hundreds of different habitat characteristics that they're looking at that are really hard to figure out. You look at the equations and it gives you a panic attack. Ours was looking at one habitat variable at a time. What could we glean by just focusing on one at a time and try to get easy to understand curves that can be interpreted by a biologist, but also interpreted by the lay public, also interpreted by a landowner, with the idea of hopefully someday, and maybe I'll get around to this because I'm a land manager now, making it into a land management. And then I got a lot of opportunities to do field work. I've done a whole smattering of different things. Most of my work was on birds. So I worked with the Oaks and Prairies Joint Venture and Texas Parks and Wildlife on grassland birds from 2017 to 2019. Very much like talking about your volunteer work. I got paid to drive around, stop every half mile, and count birds for 5 minutes. It was a pretty sweet gig for 8 weeks every summer. And then in between undergrad and grad school, I worked with U.S. Fish and Wildlife on the endangered golden-cheeked warbler, which is a really cool species. If you're not familiar with it, you can find them here in Kinney County. They occur within a 35-county area, or they breed within a 35-county area in central Texas. And so we're about as far south west as you get in their range, and then they go all the way up to Dinosaur Valley. That's about as far northeast as you get in their range. But they're a really cool species. That's some of the best work I've ever gotten to do. To this day, I don't know how I convinced somebody to pay me to go see that beautiful country. And then in my master's degree, even though I was studying birds, I had kind of a reputation within my lab of being somewhat competent in the field and knowing what I was doing. And so my professor, who was studying Dipodomys elater, that's the only scientific name I'll throw at you all presentation. The Texas kangaroo rat, which is a really cool species. If you're not familiar with kangaroo rats, it's what it sounds like. It's a rat that hops around like a kangaroo. They have a nice white fluff on the tail, and the Texas kangaroo rat, very much like anything in Texas, is one of the bigger ones that you can find. But they're likely to be listed as critically endangered sometime within the next year. And it was cool to get to work on that project. It sounded really cool and sexy. You're going to work with this endangered species and you're going to do all this cool stuff. It was a lot of driving around, looking at dirt, seeing if the hole in it was probably big enough for one of those things to live in, and then not finding them for 3 trips, and then road cruising from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., 3 a.m., not finding anything. If I ever mess up real bad and I end up in purgatory, my purgatory will be driving roads in North Texas on county roads that will all look the same and never end. Hoping for anything to jump out in front of me, even a white-tailed deer, and I didn't see anything. Finally, on our 4th trip, we did finally get some Texas kangaroo events. And then I've done a lot of volunteer stuff, a lot of unpaid work. So nest box monitoring, I did that in undergrad and master's. Golden cheek warbler surveying, that's how I got the golden cheek job. Texas tortoise radio telemetry. Contrary to what some people may say about me, I'm not a herpetologist. I'm not a reptile and amphibian guy. Javi has way more chops on that than I do, but I have a lot of friends that are, and so I tend to get lumped into that group by association. And so I've done a lot of stuff with Texas tortoise, but I don't have a lot of expertise on Texas tortoise. And then the last 2 I did after I joined on with the department. So it wasn't part of my core job, but I was paid to be there, my salary. I was a herd leader at South Texas Buckskin Brigades, which is a cool summer camp if you have grandkids that are interested in white-tailed deer management or other species as well. Brigades camp is a week-long summer camp where they do a whole bunch of activities about whatever the focus is. So there's one for ranching, there's one for fishing, bass brigades, there's buckskin, which is about white-tailed deer, there's bobwhite, which is about quail. So it's a cool program to send people to if you know somebody in your life that might be interested. And then we did a special needs fishing jamboree when I was down in Laredo at Lake Casablanca State Park. And then in May of 2022, I was hired on with TPWD. I started down in Webb County, down in Laredo, down in this district as a county biologist, like Javier. And it's the 6th largest county in the state by area, if you're not familiar. It's got 110 conservation managed land deer program standalone properties. That's 110 properties I worked with. My smallest one was 600 acres. My largest one was 62,000. All in all, together is about 600,000 acres, helping them primarily with white-tailed deer management. But because I lived and worked in Laredo at a game warden office, I dealt with a lot of urban wildlife, a lot of Prop 11 or 1D1 wildlife tax valuation, or wildlife exemption is what probably most people think of when they think about 1D1 in this room. It's the way that they tend to call it, but the tax office gets mad when I call it that, so I don't. And big deer management, right? And then now that I switched over in August of 23 to being an urban biologist, I'm up in San Antonio, which is the third largest city in Texas and the seventh largest in the United States. Instead of 110 landowners that I'm primarily focused on, I have about 1.5 million constituents split between me and one other biologist. And there's a lot of urban wildlife, a lot of Prop 11 1D1 wildlife tax valuation, and a lot of big deer management. It's not about getting the biggest, baddest deer on the landscape that you possibly can. It's usually, hey, we have way too many and they're tearing up our lawns, and what do we need to do to reduce those populations down? So when I stole this presentation from my predecessor, this was a meme that she had on there, and I think it's pretty apt. It's the what do my friends think I do? What does my mom think I do? So friends think I'm out, somewhere in the middle of nowhere riding a horse and counting birds or whatever they think I do. Mom thinks I'm cuddling cool wildlife on a day-to-day basis. Hollywood thinks I'm a tree hugger, although there are a few photos of me hugging trees, so that's not too far off. I always think about the really cool stuff, although I don't think of any time I've ever touched a grizzly, but I think of all the cool stuff I did in the field, which makes a very small portion of what I actually do overall. And then, the one thing I changed when I took this meme over was what society thinks I do. That used to be a photo of Steve Irwin. And I wish that's what everybody thought I was. But because of the popularity of a show called Lone Star Law that I'm sure everybody in this room might have heard of, everybody thinks I'm a game warden. When I rock up in a TPWD wildlife truck, I am a game warden. People walk up to me in a small town, they'll go, "Hey, Dale." And I'm like, "Who? No, that's not me." And they're like, "You're not our game warden?" I'm like, "No, sorry, I'm just passing through. I'm an urban biologist." They're like, "A what?" So that's what most people think I do. And then what I actually do, I spend a lot of time answering emails, a lot of time on the phone. It's always a treasure when I get to come out and do cool stuff and like talking to y'all. So let's drill down in on that, what I actually do. Let's try to answer that question. This is where I usually take an aside, and this is, again, when I'm targeting this at students, I teach them a little bit of a lesson that they can use in their biological teaching, that there's two correct answers in all of biology. They're always correct. They're not always the most correct, but they're always correct and they're always acceptable. And so I'll give that wisdom to you guys as well. You can use this anytime you get a question. So the first one is, I don't know. So what do I actually do? So the first time I gave this talk, I was like 2 months in to being an urban biologist. So I really did not know what I was doing, and I had not figured that out yet. I'm about a year and a couple months in now, so I have a little bit of a better idea. But usually what they say with our kind of positions takes about 2 years to really understand what you're doing and about 5 years to get really good at it. And so I still have a lot of the way to go. There's still a lot of things that I don't know the answer. And that is always an acceptable answer in wildlife. If you guys ask me a particularly tough question that I don't know the answer at the end of this presentation, I will happily answer I don't know, because it is better for me to answer I don't know than to try to make up an answer from my kind of rough understanding of what I think I might know and tell you guys something wrong. Now, I usually follow that up with, but I will try to find that answer for you. I'll get back to you. I'll send an email over. You can send it out to you guys. I can get that information for you. I just don't have it in my head. I tell those students all the time, your job in school is not to get all the information in your head and retain it for the rest of your life. Your job is to learn how to go out and get good information. So what do we actually do as urban biologists? Well, it depends. That's the second correct answer. This is always correct in everything, especially in biology. The little flow chart down here, I was looking for something that was, with WikiCommons, something that was in the public domain that I could put up there without getting into any legal troubles. And that is, apparently, if you asked a NASA scientist back in the 70s or 80s, how do you store your data? That is the flow chart that answers that question. So it depends, right? So everything from what I'm doing, it is dependent on what's going on in the world around me. So sometimes there's a particularly interesting wildlife sighting that's making the media rounds, right? And everybody's freaking out about, what they think a chupacabra has made it into town, and we got to figure out what's going on, right? Some weird fuzzy thing in a game camera photo. And so maybe I'm doing media interviews and talking to San Antonio Express News or something like that to give them a little soundbite so that they can tell people that it's okay. You probably don't need to freak out. Sometimes I'm going down to city council and putting on a suit jacket and talking to them at City Hall and talking about, like a wildlife feeding ordinance or some wildlife related policy that they're interested in implementing, and they want our opinion as the experts on it. Sometimes I'm out on a private landowner's property that has a ranchette in Bexar County on the edge of town that's interested in 1D1 wildlife tax valuation, going from an ag valuation to a wildlife valuation. I was doing that last Friday on one property that's going to be 4 properties. So getting them a plan for each one of those properties so that when the kids inherit it, they all have a good idea of what they're doing and they're all squared away with the tax office, right? So it's all very seasonal, and that's in any of our jobs. When I was interviewing for that Laredo position, they get to the end of the interview and they go, "Do you have any questions for us?" And I always try to have a couple of those on deck. And one of them was, "What does a typical day in your life look like?" And the way we do our interviews is we do these big 12-person panel interviews or 10-person panel. They're all looking at you, all these trained biologists, and every single one of them cracked a smile, and a couple of them even laughed. And I didn't really understand why it was such a funny question, but it's very hard to explain what we do on a regular day-to-day because we do so many different things and everyday things. And it's very season to season. We're in the middle of whitetail deer season right now. We're doing a lot of chronic wasting disease management. We're doing a lot of whitetail deer education outreach, helping Hollywood Park up in San Antonio with their TTP program, the Trap Transport and Process program that I'll talk about a little bit later. So drilling down a little bit on the it depends, right? So you can look at my salary, right? So that dictates a lot of what I do. Pittman-Robertson Act. So that is an act back passed a good long while ago. It's probably the first and only time in history that a group of Americans lobbied the federal government to tax them more and asked to have taxes put on long guns, handguns, and their associated ammunition. That taxes on the manufacturer of those usually gets offloaded to the consumer, and that goes into a big federal pool, and then that gets doled out to the states. And going back to your point about those volunteer hours and how special they are and how happy you are that you're getting your volunteer hours, in order to access those funds, the state has to put up a little bit, right? So they put up 25% and the feds send down 75%. Well, how I get my 25% in my position is the leveraged value of the Master Naturalist volunteer hours that we help advise. And so they value your work hour at $21 an hour, and that gets multiplied by the number of volunteer hours that happen, and that's what the state uses to justify my match. So if you are a Master Naturalist in the room or you become Master Naturalist, those volunteer hours are very important. We appreciate them a whole lot. The Master Naturalist actually spawned out of our urban program. That was the brainchild of my counterpart in San Antonio, Judith Green, and Rufus Stevens, the other urban biologist at the time. Alamo area, the one in San Antonio, was the first chapter. A lot of what I do is strengthening relationships with conservation partners. Everybody in this room is here interested in conservation, is actually giving me the time of day and the attention, which I appreciate. And so I'm working on building a partnership here. It's helped strengthening my partnership with hobbies, helped strengthening my partnership with the community here, so that individuals in the community bracket bill, if you have an urban wildlife thing come up and you need help, you know somebody that you can reach out to. At the end of this presentation, you'll have my contact information. But if you want the really nice, clean answer of what I do that I give in my quick 5-minute pitch, it's provide wildlife-specific technical guidance and recommendations to land managers in urban areas. Those land managers can be City of San Antonio Parks and Recreation. That could be Garner State Park. That could be Government Canyon State Park. That could be a private landowner with 15 acres, right? If they're in an urban area or near an urban area and they have land and they manage it and they want expertise, they can reach out and I'll give that information and that expertise. I may answer, I don't know, and I may answer, it depends, but I will try to get that information too. So why do we need urban biologists? Why am I here today? How do I justify me? So this is a map of Texas. We got 10 ecoregions in Texas. All the different names of them isn't super important. Right now we're in the South Texas Plains. And we consider about 7 out of those 10 to be threatened by urbanization. What does that mean? That means there are cities and urban areas in those regions that are rapidly expanding and modifying the habitat around them. 83.7% of Texans live in urban areas. So the vast majority of our constituency lives in urban areas. And so that's important for a few reasons. One, most of our landowners are absentee landowners. And so if we're not interfacing with those landowners when they're living in the cities, then we're missing out on important technical guidance, outreach, and information, and building that relationship. Also, the vast majority of the people that vote live in urban areas. And so that's very important. And without that kind of engagement and that kind of relationship with with our constituency, we don't get things like 2 years ago when we got the Centennial Park Fund that people passed 71% or something like that. It was a very popular resolution. We're very appreciative of it as a department. It doesn't directly impact my work, but it impacts our state parks division and give them $1 billion to go out and do land acquisition and protect lands around us. And it's not just protecting lands for recreation. Government Canyon is a good example of a natural area that was actually established for Edwards Aquifer recharge. That's another important thing I do in San Antonio. I sit on the Conservation Advisory Board for the Edwards Aquifer Protection Program. So how do we break up the state? We have 9 urban biologists for the state. 1 in Austin, 2 in San Antonio, including me, 2 in Houston, 2 in Dallas-Fort Worth, 1 in El Paso, 1 in the Rio Grande Valley with an asterisk on it. Really, I say 9, but it's really 8.25, and that's not me knocking Ernesto Garcia Ortega's work, but he is primarily a wildlife management area biologist at Las Palomas WMA. So working on that public lands, managing, it's really popular for dove hunting, and making sure that all works properly. And the other 25% of his time, he does urban duties and district wildlife biologist or regulatory wildlife biologist duties. So he wears a lot of hats and wears them well, but we only get about 25% of his time, which is why I say we have about 8.25. And so that's why I'm here today in Bracketville, which is quite a bit of ways from San Antonio, right? People ask me what area I cover. I often say it's amorphous and ill-defined. I go where I'm needed. I go to urban areas near San Antonio. If I'm the closest biologist, then that's pretty easy. If it's equidistant, it's whoever has the relationship, right? So San Marcos is a good example. That's equidistant between us and Austin. But the Austin biologist lives on the north side of town and doesn't want to have to drive all the way through Austin traffic to get down there. I live on the northwest side of San Antonio, so that makes it a little easier. Also, I lived in San Marcos going to school for 6 years, so I have a lot of connections still there. She went to Tech, so she doesn't have connections there. So a day in the life of a life biologist. What do I do? What goes on? It's a little bit more than helping coyotes put cats out. So technical guidance, I've hit on this a few times. That's our fancy word for giving recommendations, giving information to individuals, going out and doing events like this, and also going to private lands and talking to those private landowners, land managers, city council, all that kind of stuff. This is an example. If anybody's seen this paperwork before, that's the 1D1 wildlife tax valuation paperwork. I go out and I actually help those landowners write those plans. I also do a virtual workshop every year that's on our own on a program called WebEx, but it's open to the entire state. And so I get people from all over the state to come in, chat with us for a little bit, do a big question and answer session, and then we do little breakout groups based on their ecoregion so they can ask really targeted questions and help them get their management plans without having to go and contact a biologist individually or physically go to a class. Data collection. We take data on a whole lot of different things. We work a lot with our master naturalists on different projects that we're interested in. But on our own, we do mourning dove and white-winged dove surveys. I don't do my rural surveys anymore because I don't really cover any rural area, but I do my urban surveys still up in San Antonio. We do white-tailed deer surveys. That's my favorite easy survey that I do on a regular basis. That's the when I'm doing my normal job, if I happen to see a little herd of white-tailed deer, I stop for a second and I count, okay, that's 2 does and a fawn and maybe a buck in there. And then I send that data off, and our big game program uses it for some of their regulations. Coyotes, we don't directly track ourselves, but we do assist cities in establishing records keeping protocols for coyote reports, because we want to have a good idea of where those reports are coming from. If there's a lot of urban wildlife conflict that's happening in one part of town, then that's something we need to know. And then this is chronic wasting disease. Whenever we take those samples opportunistically off of roadkill, that's how we work it up in our system. We consult with cooperators, builders, developers, school districts, parks and recreation departments, government agencies, private landowners, homeowners associations, you name it. If it's in an urban area, they're interested in wildlife, we work with them. And we help them from everything from answering a quick question about what they should do about, making a pollinator-friendly space to actually helping them draw up plans and figure out, city planning type stuff. City and regional planning is the next one. So I kind of already hit on that. We work with city partners. We work with regional partners on how to actually plan these spaces so that they aren't just bulldozing everything, so that they're not fragmenting the habitat too much, that they're leaving corridors for them to work through. Public education. Here's our quick pop quiz. Don't worry, it won't be graded. What animal is that right there? No wrong answers. Throw it on. Mountain lion, okay. Anybody else? Just throw them out. Doesn't matter if they're right or wrong.
Dog.
Dog, okay. All right, we got mountain lion, we got dog. We'll leave it at that. I'll come back to it. Does that help it a little bit more? That make it a little more clear?
It's a cat. It's a cat.
So that one looks like a house cat, right? Nah, that's a big old mountain lion. What about that one?
Yeah, that's
That's a big old mountain lion. What about this guy here? Can everybody see that in the room? Maybe I enhance it a little bit.
That's a mountain lion.
Big old scary mountain lion. Actually, none of those were mountain lions. So it was house cat, house cat. The first two were the same house cat, bobcat, and then house cat. You guys were on it. You guys were getting it pretty right. But this is the kind of stuff that gets reported to me, and every single one of those was reported to us as a mountain. Right? If you see anything that's a cat in an urban space, it's a mountain lion. It's going to eat the kids, going to take the dogs. Right? That is what we deal with. I deal with at least one mountain lion sighting a week. I get about one credible sighting every 7 years in San Antonio. So it's almost always a house cat. Every once in a while it can be other stuff. We just have one over in Helotes where somebody said they saw a big old black cat. And people say it's a black panther or a black mountain lion. That has never been documented in the state of Texas ever in the history of time. That does not exist up here. We don't have jaguars and black jaguars running around up here. But then they went online and started Googling around to figure out what the heck am I looking at. And they said, I think it's a jaguarundi. Those have been extirpated from the state for many, 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 many years. And if they were present, they'd be somewhere maybe around here. They're not going to be all the way up in San Antonio, unless it's someone's illegal exotic pet that escaped or something that got out of the zoo, right? But then they called the police, and the police didn't call us. And so there was, next thing I know, on my day off, there's an APB about, big cat in Helotes. Everybody needs to keep their kids inside and keep their dogs inside. And then we were handling then the media starts reaching out to us like, hey, the police are saying we need to be worried. Do we need to be worried? And that's when we're able to say, no, it's probably a house cat. We don't know what they saw because they didn't send us any photos or videos, but it certainly wasn't a jaguarundi. And if it was a jaguarundi, you don't really need to be too concerned because they're not really the size class of animal that's going to cause you harm. But we do a lot of public education outreach, whether it's going through, hey, what the heck are you looking at? Or if it's talking to somebody on the phone that thinks they saw something scary, or reaching out to that police department and educating some of those officers about when to put out an APB and when not to put out an APB. Conferences and workshops, we put on various things, CWD class that we did when Hollywood Park, when that zone started up there, and we had a lot of questions around it. That was right before I got in. Urban Wildlife Management and Planning Conference that happened years ago back in Austin. We helped out with that. I do that 1D1 wildlife tax valuation online meeting every year. We do media, like I just said. I haven't been around quite long enough to have a whole bunch of really cool stories with my name in them or been on TV yet, but that's something that'll probably happen within this year. It's part of my SMART goals. There you go. Here's another education man. A strange creature found in Wise County. What are we looking at here? What was that? Dog with mane. Anything else? Howdy with mane. Chupacabra there. That's all I was waiting for. Yeah, little did you guys know, I got my degree in biology, but my minor in cryptozoology. So that's a bona fide chupacabra right there. It's a raccoon with mange. Raccoon with mange. If you've ever looked at an animal with fur that does not have that fur, it looks really weird. Look up and make it fair. It's very odd. It's very crazy. If they do not have their fur, they look very different than what they look like with their fur. And so that is probably where the apocryphal tales of chupacabras comes from, right? That's probably where those come from. It's back in the day. But I do occasionally, this one only happens maybe once a year, twice a year, get somebody that is dead convinced that they've seen some sort of cryptid, and they send it in. They say, I've seen a chupacabra or trapped a chupacabra, and what am I looking at? It's always a raccoon or a pop.
What do you do when you find them with that?
Well, in that case, it had passed away, and so that's it was already, the damage was kind of already done. It's one of those things that usually people want us to rush into the rescue and, put on our scrubs and go administer veterinary medicine to a wild animal, right? And go treat them and help them out. That's not really what we do. Mange is a natural disease. It's naturally on the landscape. A lot of people go, so when we tell them that, we go, we're just going to let nature take its course. If you're truly worried, if it truly seems like this thing is suffering, then we may be able to do targeted euthanasia and take the animal out if it's truly, truly suffering. Usually with mange, they can, this is a very extreme case, but they can usually fight it and do okay. If they're still moving, they're still eating, and they're still drinking, then we're usually not going to go out and euthanize an animal.
It's a farm type, right?
That's a good question. I don't know the ins and outs of mange. Yeah,
it was hairless.
Yeah, dermatophyte. There you go. Yeah, I knew at least one of us would have the fancy word in our brains with me. I didn't have it tonight.
So sometimes, like our state veterinarian may ask, hey, go and get like a scalpel or something, scrape it. Yeah, just
Yep.
so you know what kind of dermatophytes they are.
Yep. Yeah, I've done that too. We when I was in Laredo, we had a sudden raccoon die off, and we were worried about distemper. So I went out and collected a couple carcasses and sent them off to the veterinary medical lab to be tested, and had a very fun conversation with a FedEx that didn't want to ship out. They said, "What are you shipping out?" I said, "Dead raccoon." They said, "We don't do that." I said, "Yes, you do." But yeah, and then the funny part is so we go, okay, this is a wild thing. This is natural. It's not great, but nature can be kind of cruel sometimes. We're not going to intervene in them. What about my dogs? Right? That's the next call. I'm worried about my dogs. Well, actually, believe it or not, domestic dogs are the reservoir for mange, not the other way around. Like most people think the coyotes give the dogs mange, but it's actually the dogs give the coyotes. So it's like, no, that's actually not how that works. Go see your veterinarian if you're worried about your dog with mange. We will let you treat your dog at the veterinarian. We're not going to go treat a raccoon. And I'm an urban wildlife biologist. There's some of my glory photos of the year. Getting to take your bobcat to work, day, getting to band painted bunnings, getting to catch a tiny little horned lizard the size of my thumb. Band dove, like we talked about. This was a recent pollinator bio blitz that we did, and happened to have a queen on the left and a monarch on the right, land right next to each other. It's great when you get that nice little side-by-side photo, and you're like, oh, I can teach this a lot. These are Texas tortoises that I've dealt with a lot. And usually this is where I can stop my talk, but since y'all are going to be probably interested in a little bit more information, I'll go through some specific things that we've worked on, specific projects. Most of these predate me. Again, I've only been on this job for a year, so I don't have really cool fancy projects yet, but to be determined. So this was Tierra Verde golf course up in DFW. You don't normally think of golf courses as reservoirs of wildlife conservation, but they often are, and they can be if they're managed properly. And so this is a golf course that wanted to do things the right way, wanted to embrace the wildlife on their property, not fight the wildlife on their property. And so they reached out to us to work with our master naturalist and work with planners and try to figure out how they could actually manage this in a nice, responsible way. And so they did some wetland reclamation work, putting in some native plants into those wetlands. And that's what it looks like, before and after, right, in the spring. They wanted to do some grassland restoration, so that's kind of what the edges looked like when people were tearing it up and planting new stuff. By the spring, it looked like that. Here's an example of MD Anderson Prairie. This is a prairie like in an extremely urbanized part of town. And normally a park in this kind of area is just going to look like flat grass, right? It's going to look like a lawn. It's going to look like a soccer field. That's how a lot of people like to keep it. They like to maintain a non-native invasive monoculture of grass, right, which is Bermuda grass. But they were able to work with our team up there and actually manage some native grasses, tall grasses, and wildflowers, forbs in the middle there. So you have that nice little mix. And even though this is in the middle of town, it actually surprisingly supports a lot of wildlife in the middle of town. New Braunfels, this is a good example. So back in 2016, they were placed on Dry Canal Creek was placed back in 2010. And then in 2016, the Canal River was placed on a tentative list for the 303D list. which is probably not something that means anything to anybody in this room. Didn't mean anything to me until I did this presentation the first time. That is the impaired waterways list. That also doesn't necessarily tell you exactly what's going on. What that means is that that waterway, in this specific instance, likely has a high enough E. coli load that it is unsafe for human recreation. When you're in the city of New Braunfels, that has based most of your economy around recreating on the Comal River, that's a pretty worrying sign when you get that. Right now, the dry Comal Creek, that had been on the list for a long time. People knew that because it really runs dry. Those E. coli levels get really concentrated. And so it hasn't been really a good, safe recreating system for a while. But the one that people actually use for a lot of recreation is the Comal River, right? And that was a worrying sign. But it was a tentative list. It wasn't a for sure list. It was just, hey, it's trending in that direction. We might want to keep an eye on this. And so that lit a fire under city council's butts. They reached out to us. They did some research. I can't remember which university, Texas A&M, to do bacteria source tracing, where they go out and they test that E. coli and they try to figure out where that E. coli came from using DNA testing. And they found out that a not inconsiderable amount, 46%, was from non-avian wildlife, and an additional 18% was from avian wildlife. So bird wildlife, and then all the other critters, right? So they were a pretty significant source of E. coli. It wasn't, cattle was only 14%, and, a couple other livestock were 5 and 4%. Humans were 5%, right? So what do they do with that information? Well, first we did a wildlife education series. How many times have you seen people throwing out deer corn for deer inside an urban space and having them walk up to the back porch and eat out of a red Solo cup with deer corn in it, right? So did an education series about, well, hey, that's actually impacting your waterway and that's impacting your property values. And you might want to be a little bit more conscious about that. Just so you know, as a little side PSA, we do not recommend the supplemental feeding of any wildlife for any reason in urban spaces, with the one notable exception of bird feeders. So, you're just normal little bird feeders with your seed that you get from the store. That is okay. That doesn't tend to cause the really bad habituation problems and the really bad E. coli levels that we tend to see with other forms of like feeding white-tailed deer, for example. They did non-native duck and removal and egg oiling. So the muscovies, the domestic ducks, the Egyptian geese, all those non-native waterfowl that had made it into Land Park, they removed those. Wildlife feeding ordinance. So now it is against city code as of 2018 in the city of New Braunfels to feed wildlife within the city for that reason of trying to get people to please stop. It's not, they're not going to kick down your door and take you to jail or anything like that. They're going to give you a warning and then probably another warning and then a fine, and it can probably get reduced and then maybe a bigger fine if you continue to just not listen to them. But within the city limits of New Braunfels, they have that feeding ordinance. And then a deer management program. They tried to spin that up, and then city council put a freeze on it, so that didn't end up passing, but that would have been actively managing their deer population, removing deer from the landscape. That can be a little bit of a tricky political situation sometimes. A lot of people get really attached to these deer, and they don't want to think about Bambi getting rounded up and humanely euthanized and the meat being donated, right? There's the feeding ordinance signage. Hey, don't feed wildlife. Don't throw out bread for ducks. That's not good for them. Don't throw out rice for ducks. Don't throw out rice cakes for ducks. Don't throw out spinach for ducks. Just don't throw out anything for them. The thing that I often tell people that tends to resonate, because I get a lot of, I start getting dirty looks by this point in the presentation, right? And it's like, I like feeding my ducks. So when you feed them bread, they can't really process that. They love it. It seems like something they would be great for them, but they don't really get any nutritional value of it. So it'd be like if your grandkids or your kids came up to you and they said, "Hey, can we have ice cream for dinner?" And you're like, "Yeah." They'd probably be really excited about that. And then if you did that the next night, they'd probably still be really excited about it. And if you just kept doing that every single night, a 4-year-old, 5-year-old might say yes every single time, and they'd feel really full. They probably feel way too full, right? Because they eat too much. But they wouldn't be getting the nutritional value that they need to grow into, big, strong boys and girls, right? So what happens when you feed to a certain degree, especially in these urban areas where everyone's doing it, or a large number of people are doing it, is you end up with an animal that's actually slowly starving to death while feeling like it's full. And in my opinion, that's kind of a cruel way to go, right? Feeling like you're full, you don't get that hunger response that tells you, hey, I need to go get food. And then you're actually not getting the nutritional value you need to die of malnutrition. That's pretty sad, right? So that's my urgent plea to not feed the wildlife in urban spaces. You know, if it's out on your hunting ranch and you're doing it for attracting deer in for harvesting, go for it. No problem there. Just don't be doing it in the middle of town. I'm going to blow right through the rookery stuff. It's a pretty hot button issue in San Antonio, but I don't think you guys have any rookery issues here that I know of, so I'm just going to go through that. But I'll talk about urban deer. That's probably something that everybody deals with, right? So that is not normal. That is not how many deer are supposed to hang out together, right? That is abnormal, but we see it all the time in other urban areas. So what does this lead to? It leads to all kinds of different things. This is what we lovingly call hardware disease. That's a volleyball net, if anybody's curious, that's gotten wrapped up inside the antlers. That's often something like you asked with the mangy raccoon. People will go, "Hey, you need to get out here and you got to save this deer because it's got volleyball net on its antlers." Well, thankfully, those antlers shed every year. So as long as it's not stuck to the net, and it can go out and it can get food and it can get water and it can move around. They don't have a lot of predators in urban spaces, and so it'll probably be fine. Those antlers will pop off in the spring, and it will go on and it will lose that netting around its head. So we usually leave it as it is unless it's severely impacting its ability to get food and drink. So steps for success. First, you got to define the problem. So this is usually the kind of easy part. Usually when I get a big group of people together, they can all agree that there's a problem. There's something going on with the deer. There's too many of them. There's too few of them. There's definitely deer problems. Getting them to agree on which problems are the problem is usually the hard part. Identify the goals, right? So you figured out your problems. You figured out, now you need to figure out what you're going to try to do to address those problems. And then build consensus. That's usually where a lot of these things kind of fall apart, right? You get really vocal groups that are really passionate, that can't see eye to eye. But that's actually something our urban program helps with. We go in, we talk to these communities, we talk to these HOAs, and we give them the tools to and the information to understand the science behind it, and we see if that moves the needle. It doesn't move the needle for all, but it does move the needle for some, and we try to work with them to try to find out what that middle ground is, right? Maybe it's just a feeding ban, so we're not feeding them, right? Maybe removing them off the landscape is a little bit too much for this community, right? But if they stop feeding them, maybe we can see those populations start to drop back down to normal levels, and maybe the problems will start to kind of go away. And then you have to implement, right? You actually have to go out and do it. So there's a lot of different options, right? So non-lethal, these are our non-lethal options. We have feeding ordinances. I've talked about that a lot. That's just banning feeding in a specific area. We have fencing. That can work in very small scale communities. Very hard to implement on a very large place. Like Universal City is 210,000 acres. It'd be pretty hard to fence that in, right? And a lot of HOAs don't like it because putting a deer-proof fence is not necessarily the most sightly thing. We'll put a big old 10-foot fence up there. Deterrence, there's been some research into different smells, different lights, noises, all kinds of different things. I find that our urban deer just get so used to anything that it may work for a short period of time, but it's very hard to find a long-term solution that it's like, oh, you just sprinkle a little bit of mint and then your problems all go away. It's usually not that easy, unfortunately. If it was, I wouldn't have a job, right? Habitat modification. So there are some areas of the HOA or the community or the city or whoever where it may be really shrubby and really brushy and really dense, right? So maybe you modify some aspects of that habitat to make it a little bit more open. They feel a little less comfortable in there and they aren't hanging out in as high densities. Or maybe if you have a whole lot of green space that's really open that doesn't provide them any cover and they're thus hanging out in your neighborhoods and your yards, actually building up that dense cover to attract them into those areas where you want them to be. So doing modification to make it less desirable where you don't want them to be and they're causing a traffic jam, they're causing a problem. Good example of why I harp on this so much. San Antonio, we always like to be number one. We like to beat Austin. We like to beat Houston. We like it because we're always that smaller city. We like to be number one and stuff. But we are number one in the nation in one thing, and that is wildlife collisions with vehicles. So we're number one in something, right? And that's not a good one to be number one, right? So in areas where that's happening, you can modify the habitat. That can be those small things I talked about decreasing brush density, increasing brush density, or it can be like Phil Harburger Park, which is on our north side, which is an actual land bridge. So that's where they built a park over the highway, where they were getting a ton of roadkill incidents with white-tailed deer and a bunch of other wildlife too. And then they have fencing that goes out for a good ways on either side, which kind of funnels the wildlife to use that bridge and go over the highway instead of across the highway and getting hit. And they actually have a lot of success with this. They see a ton of wildlife using it. And as an extra bonus, we have trails going across it. So it works for humans too. They can get from both sides of the highway without having to cross traffic. And it's like a 4 or 6 lane highway. It's busy. And then fertility control. I don't put this on there because I recommend it. I put it on there because I get questions about it. People go, I heard about birth control. Can you do this? Can you do that? It does exist. It does work. It's like you expect. It's like birth control for humans. But the problem is you have to get it to almost every doe in the population. And doing that is really difficult. You have to have a veterinarian on staff that has the ability to access that medication and administer that medication. It ends up being extremely expensive, and it's probably the least efficient way to try to control your white-tailed deer population. It's technically an option, and if you have an infinite budget, go for it. But it is not definitely the one I would recommend. Then we have some lethal methods. We have our main program is the Trap, Transport, and Process program. There's also one called Triple T, Trap, Transport, and Translocate. That program has been frozen for many years. If anybody has heard about a little disease called chronic wasting disease, right? The idea of rounding up a bunch of live deer on the landscape and moving them to another part of the state is usually not a good idea for that disease protocol. And so we've kind of frozen that Triple T program, and it's frozen indefinitely. I don't get to make those calls, but I don't see it coming back anytime soon. So this is very similar, where you have a corral trap, you attract them in, you close it down, and then you humanely euthanize them, either a deer manager or the processor themselves. And then take it to a processor. That processor processes the meat, and then they donate it to the charity of your choice. It has to be donated to somebody. You can't be using it as a weird way of hunting in the middle of town and getting yourself deer meat and lining your own freezers. But you can donate it to different places. Hollywood Park has been doing this longer than just about any other community, about 30 years, I believe. And they donate it to the San Antonio Food, right? So it's helping to feed the homeless and the people that are struggling to get food. Individual hunting, this is technically an option. Not very popular, not very common in Texas for whatever reason, even though we have a bit of a reputation for being a little bit of a Wild West state, right? Certainly when I did a year of my schooling up in New York, that's what they all thought we did. But individual hunting in urban spaces really has not taken off. There are special cases where it happens on occasion. There's an unincorporated ranch on the edge of a urban landscape that does a little bit of bow hunting or something like that. But most of the time anybody's ever tried to spin up an urban hunting program, it usually gets shot down for safety concerns if it's in an urban area. You certainly wouldn't want to use a firearm for it. But even using a bow and aiming down and all that kind of stuff, you run into a lot of issues with it where, safety, how competent are these hunters, how are you vetting them? And then outside of that, let's say you hit it and you don't hit it perfectly well and it runs. Well, now is it running through the neighborhood, right? Is there a deer with an arrow in its gut, bleeding everywhere, going across your neighbor's yard, and they may not have been okay with that happening? So it can just create a lot of issues. But it has been successful in other states and urban areas. And then permitted sharpshooters. This is technically legally an option. This is a newer option that's on the books where cities can work with a permitted sharpshooter to use specialized equipment and safe lines of fire and all that kind of stuff to take some deer. I don't know of anybody doing it. I don't know of it actually being utilized as a program, but it is technically legal as of last legislative session. So when are you done? That's a rhetorical question. I don't know. It depends. You're never done. Once you start managing, you're always going to be managing, right? But this really gets at how do we measure our success when it comes to urban deer management? Well, people in this room that have ranches or know people with ranches, they maybe know flying helicopter surveys or doing spotlight surveys, or now we have thermal drone surveys. herd composition surveys, right? We have a million different ways to count deer, right? This is something we put a lot of science into over the years. None of those work well in an urban space, right? If I'm driving around sitting in the bed of the truck, I do not want to be doing that on I-35 or on neighborhood roads. I don't want to be shining spotlights in people's doors in Texas for obvious reasons. I'm not going to be flying a helicopter low over their house. That's not going to go over well. Neither will a thermal truck, right? And a lot of times the asphalt is pretty dang hot, so it's a little hard to tease out those deer and identify bucks and does and fawns and all that kind of stuff. So we don't tend to actually go out and do surveys and count our deer in urban spaces. I get asked that question all the time. What does the population of deer look like in San Antonio? And as a San Antonio urban biologist working for the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, you'd think I'd be able to answer that really easily. I can't. I don't know, but it's a lot, right? Many, mucho, right? I can give a lot of answers, but none of them are going to be specific. More of them would be natural on the landscape. We have a higher density than the natural rate, but giving exact numbers is hard. So what we focus on is something called social carrying capacity. And social carrying capacity has nothing to do with biology, right? So carrying capacity is the maximum number of organisms that a habitat can support within a population. It's a theoretical maximum, but for a certain area, maybe it can support 80 deer, right? And that's based on the amount of food, the amount of water, the amount of space, right? All the resources they need to live. We can't really estimate that in an urban space, but we look at social carrying capacity. And so it is how many deer are getting hit by cars, right? How many nuisance deer calls are being generated, right? You look at all these different metrics that are human driven, and you can measure those because insurance companies want to know how many people run into a deer, right? And those are tracked pretty dang good. And the number of nuisance calls that animal control gets, or the number of roadkill calls that they get, right? And you're able to kind of piece all these things together and come up with, this is the level it's at. We're not happy with the level it's at. If let's say 100 deer a year are getting roadkill, maybe 60 is an acceptable, right? Or 40 is an acceptable number. So we're going to start doing a TTP program. We're going to start modifying habitat. We're going to start doing these different things, whatever the community decides, until that carrying capacity, that number of road collisions gets down to that level. And then you can say, okay, now we can ease off a little bit. You're still going to be managing. You're just not going to be taking yours, right? Feral hogs, that's a fun one. Is that a feral hog? Yeah. It's nice to be doing this in a county where people get this right. That's Peccary tujaku. That's another. Sorry, I said I would only give one scientific name. It's just one that I like because it's one I can remember. Collared peccary, javelina, right? Not pigs, not even genetically similar to pigs. Evolved on a completely different continent from a completely different genetic lineage. This is an example of what we call convergent evolution, where they have a similar niche, they have a similar role within the environment, and so they look similar, even though they are very genetically different. Right, because they're doing similar things, and that's the optimal thing to look like to do that thing. Those are the babies. They're usually called reds. Anybody know what a group of them is called?
Purples.
Oh, purples. That's a good one. It's one of my favorite group nouns ever. It's a squadron of javelinas. I don't know who came up with that. I don't know who gets to come up with that, but I think it's a really cool one, right? A squadron of javelinas. But, there's your javelina up there, much smaller, a little bit more of an oval shape. These are your bigger, stockier. This is kind of what I would call a wild type feral hog. So we have domesticated pigs that have escaped. And then we have the more wild type razorback looking guys that are kind of your Russian boars. The domestic pigs, those have been around since the Spaniards showed up and didn't build good fences, and they got out and they ran around and they went feral, right? These are a little bit more recent. These were brought over in the 70s and the 80s for recreational sports hunting. They're the same species, but they just look a little different based on years of domestication, much like at this point they're different species, but wolves and dogs can actually interbreed to a certain degree, right? Come from similar lineage, but are not the same species. In this case, look very different, but are the same species, right? Javelina, native game species in the north, October through February. Down here, all year round. Bag limit is 2 per license year. For now, that may change in the future. We're actually doing A lot of times I'll get questions on occasion when people like hunting the javelina. They go, why is it two? And that's an I don't know, right? So way back in the day, that regulation was set. I don't know what data it was built on, but it wasn't built on a lot. And it's kind of stayed at that ever since. And so now we're actually doing research out at the Chaparral Wildlife Management Area and several other properties to figure out how we can estimate populations of javelina like we do for white-tailed deer. And then based off of that, we may adjust bag limits down the road when we, get a better idea what the population is like. As scientists for the state government agency, we don't like not having an answer of why our bag limits are set the way they are. So we're trying to remedy that right now. You do have to have a hunting license and a landowner permission required. I put that up there because that's different than your feral hog regulations, right? They're exotic non-game species that can be hunted 24/7, 7 days a week, 365, and we really would appreciate you doing it. Landowner permission is still required, though. You can't just trespass on your neighbor's land because you're hunting pigs, right? But you do not need a hunting license to hunt on private, right? For feral hog. For other stuff, you do. For feral hog, you don't. I can't tell you how bad of a situation it is when you rock up to somebody and they say, "Oh, I killed a whole bunch of pigs last night and it's a bunch of javelina," right? Know the difference between what you're shooting when you're going to make that shot. Why are they a problem? They cause a lot of damage. They can cause $5,000, $10,000 of damage, one group of them in one night. Another, this is them wallowing out, causing erosion issues. There's their tracks. So if you ever see their tracks, you know what you're looking at. This is talked about Texas Animal Health Commission regulations. I don't remember what I normally talk about on the slide. It's been a long time since I talked about it, so I'm going to go past it. And so here's a quick little pop quiz I'll give you, though. What percentage of the population of feral hog do we have to remove off the landscape to keep the population steady? Not up, not down, flat. All of them? That's a good answer. That's a good one. We'd appreciate that. 60%? Anything else? 80? You guys are actually really close to it. 70%. So you got to kill 70% to keep the population flat. That means you got to get above 70% to make that population go down. That's why when I get the question, why haven't we solved the feral hog problem yet? That's why. We have about 5 million in North America. 3 million of those are in Texas. So it's not a problem that's going away anytime soon unless we throw everything but the kitchen sink at it, and maybe the kitchen sink as well. And even that, I don't know if it'll be. But we're working on solutions. There's no silver bullet.
They breed them for 6 months.
Yeah, 6 months. So I raised pigs in FFA. I didn't release any pigs, but I raised pigs in FFA, which is kind of fun because sometimes people will show me like this group of feral pigs, and I can actually tell the breeds apart. And they go, "Okay, that's a Duroc. Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, that's a spotted foal in China. There's always one of those because they're crazy. Oh, that's a Hampshire and all that kind of stuff." Usually they're slaughtered at 6 months, and yeah, they can breed often and frequently. I don't remember how many times a year, but it's like 3 or 4 times, something like that. Yeah, it's a hard problem. So there's that slide from earlier. This little QR code here gets you all of my contact information. You can also just take a photo of that.
The scientific name of
Oh, it did?
Yeah.
What is it now?
There's a fact sheet back here that was made by Texas A&M College School. Texas Natural Research Institute for Agriculture. Texas A&M Natural Research Institute for doing a javelina study. So it's now dichotomized.
That's it.
Yeah, so it's not.
I'm a biologist. I'm not a taxonomist. I can't stand taxonomy. But my favorite example of that exact crap is when I took a course called Natural History of Vertebrates. That was in 2015, in the same summer I did field ornithology. There's several different ground squirrels that live in the state of Texas. They were all in one genus, Spermophilus, and then all their scientific names. That was hard enough to keep in my brain, but that's how I learned it. By the time I was taking mammalogy, my senior year, in the fall of 2017, they had been split into 3 different genera. So it was Amospermophilus, Xerospermophilus, and Otospermophilus, and I had to remember which species matched with each one. Oh yeah, that's crazy. Taxonomists always take things out of groups, lump things into groups. It is science and it is important, but it's not something I worry myself about. They're still javelina. Nothing's changed about their range. But thank you for correcting me on that. I will update the slide. So this QR code there, if you scan it, they get you all my contact information, get you my phone number, my email, all that kind of good stuff. You can also just take a photo of it at the bottom, or you can email Javi. He'll send it out. This is a little QR code that leads to a little quick survey to do. This allows us to continue to get funding to do education outreach. If you have time, I'll leave this slide up so you can do that. I'm also going to be emailing this presentation out to all you, or Javi will be doing. I send it to him. He'll email it out, and you guys can do it off of there if you're interested.
I have it in the back.
Cool. Perfect.
Yeah.
It just allows us to continue to get funding to do outreach. Some of that, if I have time, I'll take questions.
I have.
Yeah.
How often do you do a survey of particular areas to find out if they should harvest the deer or not?
So again, we don't typically do surveys because they're really hard to count in urban spaces. So I will say Hollywood Park, to their credit, do probably the best urban survey I've ever heard of, which is where you get the whole community together and they assign each one of the community members that's willing to help out a road, a street. And you go to this address, right? And that's where you start. They all meet together at City Hall. They have a little powwow. They give everybody the rules. And they go, okay, disperse to your street. And then they all walk along those streets and then get to a center point and then come back to City Hall. And then at the end of that, they add up all those counts. And so the main thing you're wanting to do is count everything at the same time. Now, Hollywood Park is a community of about 900 acres. That's relatively easy to do. City of San Antonio, good luck. Right. And so you're really looking at, you're not looking at the number and trying to manage it like you do on a ranch where you're trying to get those populations to go where you want them to go. You're looking at that social carrying capacity. So looking at this many, road fatalities or this many collisions with white-tailed deer. And this is the level it's at, and that's too high. We want to get that number low. And then you start managing the deer, removing them off the landscape until that number kind of gets down.
Okay, we had a survey done in 2003. They did one where they flew over us, the spotlight survey.
Okay.
And, I have a copy of it. As far as most people are concerned with the use of survey because everybody's seeing the deer in their damn backyards.
Yeah.
And we forgot them to go.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to, I'm also.
So are you asking specifically for here?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so we do conduct spotlight surveys, me and another biologist, we help match. And so for here, it's a little different.
Yes.
We have a specified line that has done very well. However, this year, previous biologists, I feel maybe didn't do a good job in kind of sorting that out. And so we're doing some surveys now. We're going to get a good count, and then we're going to go from there and see if we need to update the line and see if we're getting better numbers or more reliable numbers based off another line that we may complete. And so with that, I mean, just from us doing surveys, we get a good count. We get a good count of access and whitetail. And so, I mean, it varies. It's going to vary each night. It's going to vary too because y'all are low fence. So you have some whitetail deer here right now, but they're going to be moving pretty soon with the cooler weather, the rut going into effect.
Right.
So you may have a lot more on the landscape. And so, I mean, it's going to vary. The numbers are going to vary. Even with the access, it's going to vary too from them moving to other areas. If the habitat's good here, they may stay. If it's not very good, then they may move off. You have a lot of things kind of taking effect.
But if you are feeding,
Was there a survey done here after 2003 that you know of?
Yeah. There's currently some going on right now.
For
So,
Fort Clark?
yes.
So how can I get a copy of that?
Well,
I don't think
So-
we're finished yet.
we're not. Well, I was going to give a presentation, but I know it's kind of getting late.
Sorry.
No, but you're fine. So because us as biologists have to keep things very private, and so whoever contacts us, that's kind of who we work with, and we give everything specific that we do to them. And so I work with Matt specifically, and Charlena, and so I just provide all my information to them. Like that's all I'm required to do. And so they feel like they can give that to you or maybe write it up in some form and present that to you, and that's something they can do. But that's it's not something I'm supposed to make public.
Why not?
I mean, it's just they're a private entity, so everyone else everyone else I work
But
with,
they're the client.
yeah, everyone else I work with, everything has to be private. Like I'm not telling you what I'm doing on other people's properties. I can't do that. Like that would go against private.
Or it's landowner confidentiality.
Yeah, landowner confidentiality.
The landlord. So now I'm assuming that Richard Taylor doesn't work in Uvalde anymore. We don't. Okay, he was.
Yes.
That's a thing. 2 or 3 biologists ago.
That he was probably the first biologist for the state in Edwards, Real,
Yeah.
any Uvalde Maverick.
Yeah.
He's far gone. Yeah. So do y'all have any Matt or Charlotte? Do you have any comments on that or?
Yeah,
Um,
let me just, we've done deer counts, we go every year. So the main way that affects us is basically the whitetail.
Right.
So we're on MLD, so we get tags for that. So the deer count, that's where that means. As far as the axis is concerned about axis deer, the count has been down over the past year. So now when we did the last 2 counts, 308, 309 axis compared to a couple of years ago, which was over 600. So the count has been going down, but to answer your question, we do it every year. We do it every year with Texas Parks and Wildlife. Doesn't make a difference who the biologist is, but we do it every year. So, and we also check our deer every year for CWD. Doesn't make a difference whether it's whitetail or axis.
Yeah.
We get those checked every year. Any deer that gets sick, I turn it into the biologist so they can do its testing on stuff like that. But our wildlife management program is to what you were saying. We're kind of the anomaly. We've always hunted deer. It's different than and I've had other homeowners associations ask about how we do it, and they just don't. They want to stay away from it because liability issue. But as far as your question, we stick straight with the state. We keep with the management program with them. We're always been very hand in hand with the state. Let's just put it that way.
I have a question.
how did you get those? Or you said 2000? Who? So did Rick?
2003, I have a
Did
report.
Rick personally give that to you, or what? What was the?
Yes.
Okay.
Matt, question for you.
Yes.
How many axes are taken here? Because 300 is too much.
It's usually about 100 or something like that. But you also have to understand this. So the axis deer here, or the deer in general, is a form of revenue for the forest.
Oh, I get it.
So if you take all those deer off of here, where are you going to get the revenue? So we
I'll
take all
take it a lot better place.
Well, when we try to manage it, we try to manage it with, we want a certain amount of deer so that you're always going to have deer to have revenue.
Oh, I mean, I get it.
So, but like I said, those numbers have went down from 600 and something axis down to 300 on the count.
And these deer aren't stupid. When hunting
No.
season comes here, they know. And I can tell you they move south of Scales Road.
Yep.
And then when hunting season's over, they go back south. And it happens. Watch it every year.
Yes.
And that's the difference with our deer. Our deer are stupid in our urban area.
So I will say too, just being out here and working with the fort, there's nothing in my eyes that shows like, hey, this is bad. The numbers are bad. There's just browse lines everywhere. There's no food for the deer. Nothing like that. Nothing like that right now. Is there a lot of deer? Absolutely. But it takes time to kind of get those numbers down. And like I said, since they're doing it for revenue, you're not going to want to just kill all the deer in one point in time. I mean, you got to kind of manage it and kind of work with what you're doing.
I think also it's just don't want to lose our white-tailed deer.
Okay.
I mean,
They have not yet
white-tails
seen
are
a
native
native
and
and active.
Yeah. So
that's our big one. But the axis are just wiping them out.
why do you say wipe? How are they wiping them out?
They don't get the food. They don't eat the same.
Yeah, they don't. Then they can browse higher.
Axis eat grass and.
So
You know.
access can compete. You know, they can compete with white-tailed deer in the sense of if everything else is gone, so like the grass is gone, the forbs are gone, well then yeah, they're going to utilize browse, and then they could compete with the whitetail. But fighting and all that typically doesn't happen. Sometimes if you see them at feeders, they kind of get along with each other, but there's other issues that could occur.
Yeah.
And I mean, it varies. Interactions between wildlife vary. You may not see everything at one time, and I mean, just outright saying competing with each other. I mean, there's kind of a, I mean, there's just, there's no, like no direct knowledge on that. Could it happen? Absolutely. But I think in this situation, no. I mean, like I said, you're low fence property.
Yeah.
And so those deer are going wherever they want. And so if the habitat is not correct here, they have other places to go. They're not going to just die.
They're in my front yard.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
they're getting rid of town.
the axes are bigger here and they can reach up higher than the whitetail. Therefore, the whitetail is lacking food because of the axes.
So I mean, they're both similar in body size. They're not.
No. they're
Oh,
wrong.
okay. Okay, that's fine. I'm not going to argue with you. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, can they compete? Yeah, but them just outright eating everything, I don't think that's the issue. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I'm quite interested in things besides the animals that you're talking about. I walk the creek and the fort, kind of a walker. I wouldn't say I'm a hiker, but everyone knows I'm everywhere. And I'm extremely interested in dragonflies, butterflies, the different types of birds, the types of native plants that we have here. And we have just recently discovered that the Army was involved in doing research back when this place was first established. And there was a Dr. Edwin Mears who collected thousands of specimens from here on the fort, and they're at the Smithsonian. And so I wonder what kind of things besides, I know you're talking about land management stuff, but who does the botany part of it? Who's really interested in those kind of things that are extremely unique here?
Yeah. So when I was on my pin slide, and then I got over to my funding code, right, and I was saying birds, mammals, and associated habitats. So in our urban program, we do a lot of stuff that's not just birds and mammals, and we kind of all justify that in the associated habitats part of our funding. But usually, what we use is we work with a master naturalist. A lot of those individuals are experts on dragonflies, or experts on butterflies, or there are various things that they're interested in. We use that program, I'm naturalist, and so we do these things called bioblitzes, where we get a bunch of people out, and they go out on the landscape, if it's publicly accessible and places they can go, and we take as many observations as we can in an area. And that gets us a good idea of the number of butterflies, the number of dragonflies, the different plant species, and stuff like that. And then we, the managers here, the land managers here can take that into account in what they want to manage for. But generally speaking, if someone reaches out to us about, hey, we're really interested in, you found this really cool dragonfly and we want to manage for it, we try to give them the best guidance on how to manage that. So
there's so many in your department too.
Yeah, so we have a state invertebrate biologist that manages all of the invertebrates, the terrestrial invertebrates in the state. So all the butterflies, all the dragonflies, all the bees, all the beetles, all those things. She's very busy because it's one individual for the entire state. But if you do have those targeted specific questions, we can maybe direct it towards them, or we can work with the local master naturalist chapter to start figuring out what you have out here, and maybe go from there if there's something specific.
So just as me myself, I cover a lot of properties and work with a lot of people, and so like I'm not always open to do stuff like that. Like it just doesn't fit with my time. However, one thing that's open to the fort is working with universities who have like an interest in certain things. If you go to the back, there's a pamphlet on black bear research and mountain lion research that's going on. So that's an option for them if they're interested. We've had other individuals that we've worked with, University, Texas A&M Corpus Christi. They were doing Texas tortoise research. And so if there were any Texas tortoises here, that would have been an option for them. And so there's other entities that would reach out. They're doing botany, fish, salamanders, anything else. There's those opportunities. One thing on the master naturalist kind of deal, if the chapter was interested, I mean, there was stuff you could do here on the fort. There's areas that could be restored with native grasses, native brush species that different wildlife would utilize. So I mean, there's options to do things up here.
And if you're interested, just reach out and either my contact info, your contact info, we'll work together to get the people on our staff within their availability. It's one person for the whole state, 9 of us for the whole state, right? We're stretched pretty thin. But we do have a group called the Texas Nature Trackers Biologists, and they work with the Master Naturalist Program to do those large scale citizen science monitoring programs. That may be interested in helping set one of those things up if that's something that I don't know. I'm not the local contact, so I don't know the full breadth of what everything is, but you can
What
reach out.
did you call them again?
The Texas Nature Trackers.
Craig Hensley.
Yeah, Greg Hensley and Wendy.
So, may I make a comment? Somebody asked about what projects Brushy Canyons is doing. If somebody here wanted a project, you could reach out to our chapter and suggest that there's a project that you would like for us to take on. And I'm not saying we would, but we would definitely consider it. And you mentioned it earlier, but the iNaturalist, if everybody here on the board had an iNaturalist app and just started taking pictures and sent them up to the iNaturalist site, yeah, you could record a lot of what you see just by doing that.
It's a really cool app.
I don't know much about turtles, but last week I read about Texas tortoise. Are they around here or not?
They are here.
They should be, yeah. You would find them probably in thicker thorn scrub. I mean, they could come out to the neighborhood. It just varies. So
Yeah, they're a South Texas species up where I'm at in San Antonio, about the northern extent of their range. So
typically above 90, you may find individuals above Highway 90, but it kind of varies.
yeah, lower
Spotty, yeah.
I found them between here and Del Rio. I found them up the road going to Rock Springs. Yeah, on 334, some of the ranges. And then I found them here on the board. They're not very big on the board.
We're working on updating some of that range information. There's a researcher in Corpus Christi that's taking a good
Well,
look at
I
that.
know it, so it gets.
Yeah, she's using INAT and a bunch of others.
So unfortunately too, with Texas tortoises,
Yeah.
you have some that make it in weird spots. So like you saying Rock Springs, like that's
Not
kind
Rock
of.
Springs, it's just the road that goes to Rock
Oh,
Springs. It's
okay.
just a couple miles up.
I've had people, I've had people like Kinney Counties tell me they've seen them, and I think that's a little too. I think someone
It's a
found
little
one.
rocky there.
Someone found one, and they're like, "Here you go, buddy." And
I often joke and call them the hermit crabs of the South. People get them thinking they'd be good pets. We have them show up in Houston. We have them show up in DFW. These are not places they should be, but they're people bring them around. They're easy to catch and easy to keep alive. Not exactly easy to keep.
My grandkids, if I thought somebody did.
Yeah. It is not legal to
I
possess
didn't,
them, so
you
just
didn't
want
know.
to throw it out.
Yeah.
You're the bird guy.
Uh-huh.
I have heard the ravens are moving.
We have one ravens here.
Yeah, so we're seeing that in a lot of species. The best example I can give of this is crested caracara. Has been moving steadily north over the years as climatic patterns change, things warm up, they can inhabit further and further north because those areas don't freeze as frequently. And so areas that used to be they couldn't exist there because they get too dang cold, they can exist a little bit better. So we up in San Marcos, which I'm told back in the day, you never see a crested caracara. They're there all the time. And so they've been going further and further north. Another good example of this isn't necessarily as climatically driven, is like white-winged dove. They are very urban adapted species, and they used to only be in the valley, but now they follow that I-35 corridor up further and further north. And so it would not surprise me if the ravens are doing the same. I hadn't specifically heard that, but not denying it.
Only because I have seen them.
I saw 2 of them
right
I drive
here,
down.
But I love ravens, so when I kind of saw them coming, I heard that they're kind of
Yeah.
migrating more this way.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. Those things change over time as patterns shift.
And I have one more question. Monarchs.
Mhm.
So the population that used to come to Del Rio is not as big as it used to be. So why is that?
Well, their populations, generally speaking, are a lot lower than they used to be. A lot of our insect species are kind of in the middle of a mass extinction event for a lot of species. Insects are getting hit pretty hard. There's a lot of different pressures that lead to that: habitat modification, habitat destruction, increased use of broadcast pesticides. Right? There's a lot of things that can influence them. Removing native vegetation, planting non-native vegetation. One thing you can do to help support that with monarchs, they need milkweeds.
Yeah.
And so you can plant milkweeds on areas that you have access
Right,
to that will
native one.
the native milkweeds, the antelope horn is a really good one that allows them to lay their eggs on it and continue to survive. But yeah, their numbers are down everywhere, so it's not unique to y'all. Unfortunately, I kind of wish it was because then we could just target this area, but it's all across the country.
Right.
They are one of our migratory butterflies, so they go from up here in North America all the way down into like Brazil and Central America, and there's a lot of dangers on that path.
The most interesting thing that I've noticed is on a place I've got out in northeast Kinney County, which is kind of the start of the hill country, just about. But I remember as a kid, I saw of course, a lot more about horned lizards, horny toads, as we call them. But now I see a lot of these, I call them tropical lizards, but they're I call are Mexican lizards, and I just assume that they have been coming north also, and they're typical. They're striped and they're multicolored sort of.
And they're big.
Race runner like whiptails.
And they're big.
Well,
I said they're big.
And they're big, yeah. They're about that long, the adults.
Are they thin? Are they a thin body?
No.
No, not really.
do you have any photos?
Oh, so
No, I don't. I wish I did.
I think we do something.
they're the what?
I don't know, but I never saw them as a kid growing up.
Yeah.
It's
Well, and
interesting.
there's some of that competitive stuff going on. I mean, this is just conjecture. This is
Yeah.
not gospel. But you could have with decreased numbers of horned lizards now. There's opened up spots for different other lizards to come in and be more prevalent. Some that can tolerate our habitat modifications may be beneficial to some and detrimental to others. And so that may be what's going on there. I don't know.
I'm trying to get a picture of them.
Yeah.
They always right up at the back door of my little hunting cabin.
Yeah.
That's where I would see them. They get up there and warm themselves on the the afternoon
Well,
sun.
I'll volunteer more work for Javi. Just send them to Texas.
Yeah, and I'll say I usually get a lot of people tell me they don't see a lot of horned lizards anymore, but I typically see a lot. So I don't know. That's kind of just a
I'm not blaming them. I'm not blaming horny
That's
toads.
what I was
The lack
surprised
of
when I
horny
saw
toads.
them like that.
Yeah.
We don't see them.
And I mean, like right now, you're probably not going to see a lot, or like
Getting a little cold.
if you've got your property, you may go outside to your back porch and maybe see some that hunker down, but their activity's slowing down with the winter coming. I mean, they're not going to be moving as much. Usually early spring and then kind of like or I'd say early October, they'll start moving. They're moving back to where they hibernate, or just coming out of spring. They're coming out just to do, natural behavior, breeding, all sorts of.
One thing I like to throw in on the horned lizard: responsible pesticide use.
Yeah.
So the fire ants, it's okay to knock them out. Those big red harvester ants, the big ones,
Yeah.
you don't want to knock those out. That's their obligate food source. They eat about 70 a day, and if you knock those out, then you lose your horned lizard. So
If you poison those ants, will they eat the poison ants?
yes,
Yes,
they'll
yeah.
get sick.
I mean, they're not gonna know. They're gonna eat them, and it's gonna be a build-up effect kind
Yeah,
of.
it's called biological magnification. And so it's not enough in one to kill it, but if they eat 70 a day, that builds up and builds up and builds up.
So not like herbicide though. It's just pesticide specific for.
Yeah.
Um,
I got harvester ants a lot in certain places I try to control.
Yeah.
I just didn't know.
Yeah, I mean they're a really good one to keep around. They're native. They aerate the soil. I know the bite can be pretty gnarly, but other than that, they're a lot better than a fire ant.
The nice thing is though, you can actually see their mouths.
Yeah.
so
So you're not gonna step on it.
No.
yeah. So when they
Well,
bite,
even if you do it,
Stage.
It's not very, I rarely do this by.
so when they bite you, I mean they bite you, and you don't really feel them hanging on, but it's just when they sting you, they have venom in the back that they hit you with.
It burns for a while.
Yeah. So it's
It's
yeah.
annoying.
I mean it's
but it's not aggressive.
typically no.
I was spending a lot of time traipsing around in the tall grass, and I've only been stung once.
I mean you're gonna notice them. I mean they have got big old mounds, so you should notice. Stay clear. You see them making highways.
Yeah.
Go off the highway.
I got mounts
Oh,
out
it's
here for 30
follow.
yards. Yeah.
Yeah, you probably have a good population
And
of horned lizards.
yeah.
Yeah. So any other? I had a PowerPoint, but it's kind of winding down. So yes, sir. Go ahead.
All right, 2 years ago, there was a lot of turtles before the water dried up. Where the hell did it go?
So I was told a while back that I guess a group called Texas Turtles came, and I guess they somehow moved whatever turtles you had from.
Yes.
I don't know. I guess it's not the pool, but you'll have a little area where
Yeah.
I guess they
That's right.
put the
It
spring.
didn't go dry, yeah.
And I know, so periodically that happens where you'll have like Las Moras Creek dry out. Ideally, the turtles will just move on. Like they have other places they can go to. Some might just stay and they're gonna be kind of there with nothing. Y'all are unique where you have like the golf course also and there's water being thrown, so they may just stay around and they don't absolutely need water, but it's part of them just doing any kind of life cycle. So as long as they're moist for periods of time, they may be fine. But yeah, so it's one of those things that's good or bad. It's not necessarily good, some of the turtles that are there. So if you have a bunch of reddish sliders, I mean, reddish sliders are not a good turtle
We have
species.
Korzugi here, which is a very good turtle.
Which is that, or what's the common name?
Is a
Yellow mud.
it's called a river cooter.
River Critter?
Okay,
Yeah,
river
Texas River
cooters,
Critter.
okay.
They're good.
Yeah, they're a very good turtle that we have here.
Okay. And so I don't know what Texas
They're very
turtles.
well known up and down. There's been a few people up here today.
I got you. I don't know what Texas turtles did with those turtles. I think I was told by a parks employee that they took them to the Devil's River State Natural Area. I don't, if they dumped them there, they're not coming back. Like that's kind of
Big part.
that's yeah.
Far enough to move it far.
Yeah. So that's kind of one of those deals. If you have any that come in, I mean that's kind of just them naturally dispersing. Maybe they're in someone's stock tank and they just kind of came to the spring where they found good habitat. So yeah.
Any other questions?
You want to wrap up?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming out.
Thanks, Ram.
Yeah. Thanks for having us. There's